Hello students. The welfare state was basically born with a commitment to maintain a basic subsistence level in the economy with the purpose of ensuring that those segments of the population who are unable to contribute to the GNP will still be able to maintain their subsistence. Tracing the evolution of the welfare state in the Western world, La Chapelle records, in the Western Hemisphere, states were established as a means to respond to their population's need for security. Evolving originally around the issue of border protection, this need soon extended to a host of social domains. In time, the baseline functions of the state encompassed protection of the territory against outside invaders, enforcement of law and order, economic stability, and the promise of rational and finally basic trading regulations between contracting partners. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the state strengthened its economic position. It endeavored to stabilize the economy, maintain full employment, stimulate growth, ensure price stability, and support external viability. Barry notes that the emergence of the modern theory of welfare depended on the reinterpretation of certain key political concepts like liberty, equality, and community. If people were held together by social bonds that transcended contractual relationships, then they could make claims on each other as citizens of a common enterprise which could exceed their contributions as measured in more calculative economic terms. From this perspective, state welfare would cease to be regarded as an act of charity. It is rather a form of entitlement, a right. The welfare regime and social policy in India today have to be viewed in the context of the overall situation of and shifts in state policy and government since the time of India's independence. At the beginning, India was an interventionist and a developmental state seeking to achieve the aims enunciated in the directive principles of state policy, namely the removal of poverty, social justice, self-reliance, and growth. Different recipes and structures were debated and concretized in successive 5-year plans. The principles formulated included free and compulsory education to the children, a public healthcare system and higher education system, economic and social rights for women, as well as for the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and other backward classes and religious minorities, along with adequate means of livelihood for all citizens. India has a history of detailed and diverse social policy programs, in view of which many claim that the content of welfare in India has become somewhat fuzzy. Some scholars suggest that while the second plan had the least to say in terms of welfare, it went further in laying out a social policy. On the other hand, while the rhetoric increased from the late 60s, early 70s, Garibi Hatao slogan, it is from the fourth plan that the content of social welfare has become rather fuzzy. The welfare regime became a patchwork of programs and could even be described as piecemeal, haphazard, and reactive. What about welfarism in the liberal regime that is unfolding in India since the 1980s? We know liberalism never operates in a level playing field, so definitely there will be winners and losers. Not all will be able to take advantage of the opportunities unleashed by liberalization. So how does one look at welfare in a liberalized context? After the neoliberal reforms, there was a further and clear shift in advocating private sector expansion in health, education, and other social services, and denial of state responsibility in these areas, even for the needy and poor groups, with the levying of user fees. The gradual withdrawal of the state and its ad hoc treatment of the social sector are reflected in the trends in social sector expenditure at the moment. Globalization can and certainly does bring about growth, but the important question is, does this growth accrue to all? the beneficial aspects of growth may not percolate to all strata of society. Under no circumstances, therefore, is the role of the state curtailed or precluded. Poverty incidence in India has been falling at a trend rate of about 1 percentage point per year since about 1970, and the country now appears to have returned to this trend since the macroeconomic difficulties of the early 1990s. One encounters heterogeneity in impact of development and the reality of regional disparities. The performance of states across India has widely differed in the liberalization age. Widening regional disparities and limited growth in lagging areas has made the overall growth process less pro-poor over time. By and large, economic growth in India has not occurred in the states where it would have the most impact on poverty nationally. These differences in the impact of growth on poverty relate in turn to differences in access to infrastructure and social services like healthcare and education that make it even harder for the poor people to take up the opportunities afforded by aggregate economic growth. Such heterogeneity in the impact of growth on poverty holds important clues as to other needs to be done by governments over and above or beyond promoting economic growth in order to ensure poverty alleviation. But it seems there is really no alternative to state intervention. In view of the disparate effects of globalization in countries across the world, particularly with reference to countries in the third world, one feels that there is hardly any alternative to state intervention in the form of various kinds of institutional support like insurance, subsidies, etc. In fact, it is commonplace to argue that the increasing openness of national economies has meant growing insecurity, and such insecurity has often propelled national governments to respond through greater welfare measures in the form of insurance. In 2001, the World Commission on the Social Dimensions of Globalization acknowledged the immense potential of globalization for good. The real problem was that this potential was not being adequately realized. Poverty was declining substantially in some parts of the world, but unfortunately rising in others. New inequalities were developing and employment growth was inadequate. But is the culprit liberalization or globalization? Perhaps not. The World Commission on Social Dimensions, taking a critical yet positive approach, argued that the problems associated with globalization are actually the consequences of poor governance at all levels, and as such it would be erroneous to hold globalization responsible for all the ills associated with liberalization. And better governance has to be built on an ethical framework in which are to be embedded core values such as respect for human rights, tolerance and diversity, accountability and democracy. Only through such improved governance would it be possible to ensure opportunity for all and inclusion on terms which were fair. The responsibilities equally lay with all, states and individuals. And not only that, also other social actors have to respect the ethical framework. National governance built on democratic principles, respect for human rights, gender equality, rule of law, and adequate voice and representation constituted the essential foundation if the intended benefits of globalization are to reach all people. But the state not only had to be honest and accountable, it had also to have the capacity to manage integration into the global economy, to deliver public goods, and to raise capabilities of people and enterprises. Indeed, capacity building is an important obligation which the state in a world of globalization ought to recognize. And that is why the importance of 3 E's: education, employment, and empowerment. In this process, education provides capabilities to take advantages of the opportunities which could well surface with the advantage of globalization. Employment was another key to ensuring that the global economy delivered on people's goals, and employment had to be created locally in ways which fitted in with the people's social, cultural, and economic aspirations. And it was equally essential to empower local communities and build responses to globalization around these aspirations rather than leaving them to be steamrolled by global forces. Hence the debate about welfare policy. The whole climate about political debate about welfare policy seems to hover over two important questions: whether government should provide jobs for everyone who needs, and whether government should reduce income differences between the worse and the better off people. It has been opined that there is no conclusive evidence to suggest that cultural values have shifted sharply against welfare, even with the dawning of the age of liberalization. In fact, the politics of welfare cutbacks involve peculiar difficulties for governments. This contributes to the pressure on welfare states and emphasizes the importance of national, political, and institutional frameworks in determining how policy develops in different contexts. The World Commission on the Social Dimension of Globalization in 2004 observed that globalization and liberalization of multilateral trade creates imbalances and economic tensions between the haves and the have-nots. Such imbalances have a more serious impact on women. Incidentally, a great number of women are involved in education, social security, and health care. And because of this factor, it is imperative to set up social protection systems in order to build up an equitable distribution of the profits of globalization. And herein comes the question of the responsibility and the role of the state as a manager of globalization to ensure that the advantages of globalization accrue to all. As Bhaduri categorically remarks, the most important feature of the market mechanism is that it is not directly accountable to the participants, but in contrast, the state is accountable. In a political democracy, the majority cannot trample on the rights of the minority simply in the name of majority rule. And in this sense, the notion of democratic legitimacy and accountability involves not just majority rule, but extends also to the protection of rights for the minority. A similar argument applies to the functioning of the market economy. If its functioning marginalizes and denies almost everything to a significant minority, the state as the accountable institution may have to, and in fact must, intervene. Kothari therefore draws attention to the growing evidence of a rise in mass consciousness in India among the hitherto marginalized sections of society who have also begun to assert themselves in elections, in legislative bodies, and forums of political parties. In an age of globalization, this is contributing towards disempowerment and increasing marginalization of the state as a result of both the discontent and the alienation of the mass of the people who had for a long time relied on the state for their own empowerment. These people have of late been of the view that the state is no longer available to them for the empowerment they have been desiring, and they will need to devise their own strategies and institutions, increasingly relying upon civil society and their own community resources to deal with problems they face in the contemporary age. The case of the Forest Rights Act is an apt illustration. The Forest Rights Act, enacted by the Indian Parliament in 2006, is an illustration of the increasing role of civil society vis-à-vis the state in India. The Forest Rights Act, in fact and interestingly, did not emerge from unproblematic and consensual deliberations. Rather, the struggle to pass the act and to keep the key elements intact was fraught with intense contestation taking place among various groups lobbying with its own interests. Central to the process of policy development in this case has been the use of collective pressure through an unusual coalition of interests spread across the states of India, which ultimately paved the road to the new institutional settlement. The case of the Forest Rights Act throws light on the importance of protest or campaign politics in India and the simultaneous importance of activists to form effective coalitions involving individuals and groups in order to influence the course of legislation, particularly pro-poor legislation. And the role of the state in the wake of globalization therefore comes to the surface. Under globalization, the imperative to liberalize has demanded a shrinking of the state's involvement in national life and promotion of privatization of public enterprises, resulting in job cuts that is often expressed as downsizing. This has limited the government's ability because of huge budget deficits and has required the curtailment of expenditure in education, public, food subsidies that benefit the poor people. However, poverty eradication requires a state where the government is based on the principles of a true representative democracy. So definitely the state cannot shirk from its responsibilities even as liberalization unfolds. Today, the third world countries are seen to be confronted by a formidable array of challenges. Rising debts, instability, an increasing minority affluent class, and a growing majority of those living below subsistence level is the state of affairs in such countries with little prospects of development. However, for a free market economy based on free competition to flourish, it is essential that the state ensures a fairer measure of opportunity for all, and not only that, it must also provide necessary supportive action. That the problems faced by the third world countries continue to be pressing, like poverty, basic education, healthcare being the foremost, these can hardly be exaggerated. Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen therefore emphasize the force with which public support programs can work even when a country is quite poor in terms of GNP per head. This makes it possible to do something immediately about conquering deprivation and raising the quality of life without having to wait quite some time before plowing back the fruits of economic growth into improved health and longevity. Unless people live, how will the question of the advantages of growth accruing to them arise? That immediacy is an important aspect of the promise of support-led security, and it can substitute for a good deal of fast economic growth. Clearly, there is need for supportive role of the state, and this role of the state has been highlighted by Aziz. First, a major constraint in the third world countries relates to the inequality of distribution of income and political power. Second, the third world is also constrained by poverty of basic human capabilities, which denies the poor to take advantages of marketing opportunities. Third, subsidization in the rich countries has an adverse effect on the developing countries. To begin with, it keeps world prices low so that they get little for their commodities. Second, it also excludes their participation from food markets in rich countries. Fourth, there is a need to concentrate more on pro-poor investments. As the informatics revolution has made technologies increasingly transferable between countries, there is need to ensure that the poor also remain important stakeholders of such exchanges in technology. Fifth, land reforms in particular deserves mention. The developing countries must ensure assets are accessed by the poor. This is where the Forest Rights Act becomes very significant in the context of India. Sixth, need for supportive institutions, particularly in the realm of finance, is also clearly felt. With no surplus and little or negligible savings, credit can help the poor to accumulate assets and engage in markets. And finally, an important factor in reducing poverty is investment in human capital. It is also one of the keys to successful and equitable participation in the global markets. Illiteracy and ill health are obvious impediments for building prosperity in a competitive global economy, because these are areas as a result of which several segments of the population fall behind because they are unable to take advantages of the opportunities opened up by liberalization. There are also loopholes of welfarism in India. There are very few universal concepts in the Indian welfare regime. The few that were in place as health and education were differentially, unevenly, and minimally available, or not accessed at all by those who had the means to avail of private facilities. Claims at striving for universal availability and access were not matched by allocated resources, leading to both a paucity of facilities and poor quality in services. This has been accentuated since the end of the 1980s with the push of privatization and targeting of universal programs. The poor often could not or did not access public funded facilities due to their non-availability or the immediate loss of wages or of their family workers that accessing the facility, as in the case of schooling, entailed. So therefore, the role of the state is clearly not curtailed by globalization. Globalization in the late 20th century embodies a worldwide interconnectedness consequent upon the rules of the game enunciated by the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF, the World Bank and the WTO, which seek to usher in the dominance of the market mechanism across the world. The growing dominance of multinational business across the world and the withdrawal of the state from the traditional areas of decision making as a result of the dominance of world governance through rules encouraging international trade, liberalization, deregulation and the like seem to suggest a rollback, even eclipse of the state. But although the state has withdrawn from certain traditional domains of activity, the role of the state actually is not thereby curtailed. It has to emerge as a manager of globalization and live up to its welfare responsibilities. Even in the advanced industrial democracies, where governments seem to be able to pursue welfare retrenchment with little effective resistance, contemporary research has not projected any conclusive evidence to actually indicate or even support that cultural values have shifted against state welfare. Therefore, state intervention remains vital in the third world. When one tries to assert and assess the impact of globalization in the context of the third world, the role of the state seems all the more strengthened. The handicaps of poverty, unemployment, illiteracy, and inadequate, if not dismal, healthcare in the third world make it evident that the intervention on the part of the state is indispensable not only to ensure that the relatively disadvantaged sections of the population are able to utilize the opportunities offered by globalization, but also to provide support to those sections who fail to benefit from the economic growth ushered in by globalization. The state, after all, remains an accountable institution. Unlike the market, the state is accountable to the electorate. The growing evidence of a rise in mass consciousness in India and many countries across the world, particularly the third world, seem to suggest civil society groups and organizations must bring their influence to heavily bear on political institutions, including the state, and pressurize them to enact policies that better meet the needs of their population while respecting their diversity and distinctiveness. In this case also, the Forest Rights Act in India is an apt illustration, and one must particularly remember the role of civil society organizations and the extent to which they are instrumental in this legislation. And the role of local networks in implementing welfare measures is also important. The nature of the state and the political system in India means that local contingencies and political histories affect social policy quite distinctly. While regional differences in agriculture, industrialization, and income levels delimit the possibilities and the choices, it is in social policy that provincial governments and regional parties can mark their difference from or unity with the central government. They can respond to as well as build local constituencies to echo policies decided at the center. Local networks are critical in the implementation of social programs, especially where higher governmental levels do not give those programs priority. And it is this kind of decentralization in approach that will actually make welfare a reality. It is one thing for a central government to pronounce the policy change from a distant center, but it is quite another thing to actually ensure that all those policy changes meet with the desired outcomes and the advantages accrue to the people for whom they are intended. It is only through this kind of a multi-pronged strategy a perfect coordination between the centre and various levels of local governance, that welfarism will become a reality in India. Thank you.